Kai fam, we got Jamie Emerson, bouldering developer, legend, author of our guidebooks in Kaya and physical paper guidebooks as well for Mount Blue Sky, formerly Mount Evans, and Rocky Mountain National Park. Here today to give us some cool history, context, how to take on the Alpine, good ethics in the park, things like that, which is like a can of worms, but we can get like at least a baseline out of the way for folks who've maybe like never been up into the Alpine before or something like that. So welcome. And maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your climbing history.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Eric. My name is Jamie. I am a climber of 30 some years. I grew up in Michigan, moved to Colorado. After visiting Rocky Mountain National Park for the first time, I was totally blown away by the scenery, the climbs, the style, the setting, everything. And yeah, that brought me to Colorado, and I've been living in Colorado for the last 20 years or so, 25 years. And yeah, boulderer, guidebook author, route setter, philosopher of climbing ethics. That's me.
When you first went to the park, do you remember what year that was?
Yeah, that was 2001. So it was right after I was actually over 9/11. So my first day in the park was a few days before 9/11, and then I was in just climbing up there while that happened. So yeah, that was, let's see, 2001. So it's 2024. So it's 24 years of bouldering in Rocky Mountain National Park.
And when you first went in 2001, what did bouldering in the park look like? Because people weren't going up into chaos yet, right?
Yeah. So one thing that's hard to understand, just kind of looking through time at the way that bouldering has progressed, is that alpine or bouldering in the Alpine just wasn't a thing that people did. If you look historically, the only real Alpine boulder problems that were kind of documented were John Gill, and those were roadside up in the Medicine Bow Mountains outside of Laramie, Wyoming. No one was hiking 2 miles in the late 90s and early 2000s to go bouldering. That seemed crazy to most people. And in fact, I worked at when I moved to Boulder, I used to work at the Spot Gym, and people would be like, "You go up to Chaos Canyon? Like, that's so crazy. Like, I can't believe you'd hike 2 miles. You could just go to Morrison, you could go to Flagstaff, it's right there. And it's just practice climbing anyways. Like, why would you care?" But all I could care about was going bouldering. It was the coolest thing in the world to me. So yeah, there was a huge shift in where we were at that time. Hiking pads in was a new thing. And to where we are now, where it's just totally common that people hike 30, 45 minutes, even an hour and a half to go bouldering.
And so where were you climbing in that initial trip? Were you up in Chaos, or were you like in Emerald Lake or at the roadside stuff kind of earlier in the park?
So all of it was focused there were boulders at Emerald Lake, which I did not visit on that trip, that had been established a while before. But Dave Graham had been the one who spearheaded the development in Chaos Canyon, which is, if you've ever been there, it's one kind of valley over from Emerald Lake. And so yeah, I was bouldering in Lower Chaos. That trip, I hiked all the way up to Upper Chaos, the meadow, which is kind of an iconic landmark there. And I just saw Dave's like fresh chalk on the Green 45, which became Jade, and the Left El Jorge, some of those boulders there. So I did hike up to, and he had just freshly cleaned some of that stuff off. Those were new climbs at the time.
And did you already know Dave at this point?
No, actually, so there was one small article in Climbing Magazine, and there was a website which I think is still active, which is newenglandbouldering.com. Dave was emailing like kind of trip reports to newenglandbouldering.com, and they would publish like the new problems that he had done. And as someone who is like super excited about bouldering, the idea that someone was climbing V12, V13, first ascents up in the mountains, I mean, that just seemed like the coolest possible thing to me. And so yeah, I was very excited to go be a part of that, just check it out, see it. It seemed like the coolest thing in the world. And so when I went there, I think it was the first or second day I went there, I actually met Dave. He was trying a project which was called the Dashboard, or Stars and Stripes, I guess it's called now, but it was the Dashboard project. And I tried that with him. got to know him, met some other climbers like Chad Greedy and Jason Kale were there. And yeah, that kind of launched my interest and involvement in Rocky Mountain National Park.
When you first visited the park, had you already moved, or was that like a trip and you decided to move based on how the trip went?
Yeah, that was a trip to decide what I thought about bouldering in Colorado because I had heard and I had no idea. And I went there. It was more crazy, more wild. The rock was swirlier. Everything was just amplified in a way that I couldn't have imagined. And I was hooked immediately. All I could think about was getting back as soon as possible. And I moved that December, just a few months later, out to Colorado, specifically just to boulder in the park. I didn't even know that there was other. I mean, I knew there was other bouldering in Colorado, but I just wasn't very aware of what else had been done. But the park was kind of ground zero.
Yeah. And so then in the following seasons, you're like now homies with Dave and Chad and those guys, and you just started like joining in on that kind of like siege every summer.
Yeah, there was, it was a very small group of people, which is hard to believe given how many people visit the park and go bouldering and how much you hear about it. There were 10 or 15 people that were core boulderers that were going up there. People like Paul Otis, Tom Mullen, who wrote the Nevada or the Red Rocks guide and I think works with Kaya.
Mm.
Um, Chad Greedy was there, Dave Graham, obviously, Brian Capps, Herm Feisner, Tommy Caldwell. Obviously, he was the one who was the really the first person to go up there and start bouldering. In fact, I tell this story. It's kind of funny. The first stash pad I ever found in Rocky Mountain National Park had a name and a phone number written on it, and it was Thomas Caldwell.
Huh. Wow. What year was that?
This would have been 2001. So at
Wow.
the time, again, it's hard to you have to reframe the entire kind of the way that you're looking at bouldering is a handful of people going to a small unknown area. No one was paying attention to what we were doing. No one seemed to care. To leave a pad behind, it's like Tommy could leave that pad behind and they would only be seen by six other people who were going to that project at that day. It was just a totally different scene, a totally different vibe. And yeah, that wasn't a big deal at the time.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good opportunity. We can talk a little bit for folks who don't have any context on the park about like some of the bureaucracy involved with accessing the park in general right now. And then also just like some general alpine ethics stuff to get out of the way.
Yeah, sure. So, Rocky Mountain National Park, it's a national park, which is managed, every national park is managed under its own specific rules and regulations, although there are blanket kind of rules and regulations that apply for all national parks. It's also a wilderness area. And so that is a more restrictive kind of land management than just a national park. For example, you can't have any motorized equipment in a wilderness area. And, one issue that's come up, that's kind of a modern issue, is that the use of the Makita fans, those have motors in them and they are not allowed, for example, to be used in Rocky Mountain National Park. Um, as the popularity of the park grew and has grown tremendously, people continue to stash their pads and it became a gigantic issue. People don't want to carry their pads a couple miles. It's about a 30 minute walk to Lower Chaos. People just don't want to carry their pads. And we've heard time and again, I have a working relationship with the rangers at the park. I know them personally. They're really frustrated by people's lack of caring and concern and kind of entitlement that they can kind of do whatever they want to. So, one thing as a guidebook author, I always want to convey, these aren't my rules. These are the rules that are laid out by the Rocky Mountain National Park Rangers, and they're looking at us to kind of police ourselves. And so the better we can do hiking your pad in every time, making sure you clean up some trash. It's not an outdoor gym. It's not a gym at all. It's an outdoor experience. It's a national park. We want to show respect and treat the place with kindness and care so that it's around and available for us to climb for, the rest of our lives.
Yeah. And I know that like you've caught significant slack from various parties in the Colorado climbing landscape. And we've talked about it at length too. And what you've kind of told me in the past that stuck with me is you were like, I don't really care what people do, but I don't want the park to get shut down. And like, I'm going to do what I can to ensure that the park stays open. And that's like the priority. And so I think
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Every area is different. And, I think there are some areas where stashing pads, it could be okay. But in Rocky Mountain National Park specifically, there are a ton of boulderers going up all the time. And like I said, I do have a working, ongoing relationship with those rangers. And they have told me many times that they are at their wits' end with climbers' behavior, lack of respect, entitlement. And like ultimately, the thing that I am fighting for is that they don't shut it down, that we have access, that we can go there. It's a place for me that's been, some of my, wildest dreams in climbing were fulfilled there, and projects that I had, lifetime projects, new climbs that I had found and cleaned. It's just a very special place. And for some of us, that becomes almost religious or spiritual. And to think about that would just be closed down because you're too lazy to hike a crash pad up, I think that'd be really unfortunate. And ultimately, I'm always fighting for the protection of those boulders and that space, that we have access to it.
Mhm. And so then also for some additional context, I know that there's quite a lot of areas that you included in the Rocky Mountain National Park guide, and that's in Kaya. There's moraine and there's elklands, right? And the park
Well,
proper, Wild Basin. I guess right now, like we're about to head into alpine season, so most people will be accessing the climbing in Chaos Canyon, Lower Chaos, Upper Chaos, and that Emerald Lake, and that's all accessible via like the Bear Lake parking. So maybe you can also add some context into like if you want to go up there, there's like the timed entry system and all that. Any sort of other guidelines beyond hiking your own pads and not stashing your pads.
Yeah, so if you do want to access Chaos Canyon and Rocky Mountain National Park in general, you do need a timed entry permit. So you can go to recreation.gov and get a timed entry permit. So if you want to visit, if you say, oh, it's Tuesday and we want to go on Saturday, those permits do get swooped up pretty fast. They're constantly kind of tweaking the kind of timelines around the permits, and so those are always subject to change. So I would just say check the recreation.gov website for the specifics on how you can access a time permit, but you do need a time permit. It doesn't guarantee you a parking space at the Bear Lake parking lot, which is the parking lot that you would use to access areas like Emerald Lake and Chaos Canyon, Upper Chaos. And so even if you do get a time permit, you may not have a parking space. It never hurts to show up early. The earlier, even if you have your time entry permit, showing up earlier in the morning will kind of ensure that you have a better chance to get a parking spot. And then, just beyond that, I think it's very important to understand that, you're not on a moon board. You're not on in a climbing gym. You're outside in the wilderness interacting with nature, and there's a natural world. Not everyone is there to enjoy bouldering like you are. Maybe not everyone is there. The park isn't set up for bouldering specifically. It's set up for the enjoyment of all people. So, the park recommends not playing music. You can always wear your headphones. Be considerate of others, yelling and screaming, kind of obnoxious behavior. We also want to be sure that, the landing building has been an issue. And, the park has told me specifically that it's okay to move some rocks around, but, we're not out here building gigantic structures, kind of at all costs, no matter what, this boulder problem has to get climbed. That's certainly not the way that I would approach my own climbing in the park. And again, ultimately, all this stuff is not to make people feel bad, or not to try to put people in their place, or not to pump up my own ego or anything like that. It is literally just to be in the good graces of the rangers. They are the ones who do have the ability to shut the area down. They have closed off areas before. And so we just want to do everything we can to be in their good graces to ensure that we do have access to those places.
Yeah, sweet. And then I think the other thing that I would add, if you're listening and you want to go up into the Alpine, is like it's pretty serious up there. Like it's a big hike. Bring lots of water, bring lots of food, maybe do some education before you go about storms up there because it's a very dangerous environment. And then maybe that can also pivot us into talking just a little bit about Mount Blue Sky, formerly Mount Evans, and Lincoln Lake. I know that the parking's been an issue in recent years. So
Yeah. So great point, Eric. Like it goes without saying that you're going into the mountains, and the mountains are a very extreme environment. And on a nice day in July, it's 90 degrees down in Denver and it's 75 in the park, and it just feels calm and peaceful. That can turn in a second. And if you're not prepared with a rain jacket, with water because you're at high elevation, with proper food, we had a climber, a very dedicated and serious climber who was struck by lightning on the hike down from Chaos Canyon. He did everything right and was still hit by the lightning, and it nearly killed him. And thankfully he's still alive. He's still climbing, Minko Ninkolov. But it's very important to take it very seriously that you are in a mountain environment. It's a very serious environment. And even a broken ankle can suddenly turn into something very serious. Someone just steps on a pad or doesn't, oh, I took my old pad out and it doesn't have a lot of foam in it, and I rolled my ankle, and then maybe there's a bone sticking out, and things can escalate quickly. And you're not going to have access to a car or a rescue right away. You're going to need to make a phone call. You may not have cell phone service in some places in the park. It never hurts. I always take a InReach, a Garmin InReach, so that I can hit a button. I had a good friend who hurt his leg when a boulder fell on it. He had to hit the SOS button. So it's very important to take it very seriously. Again, you're not going into a climbing gym. You're going into a very serious alpine environment. And to your second point about Mount Evans and Lincoln Lake, Lincoln Lake is a very high elevation area. The far parking area at Lincoln Lake is 12,800 feet. That's almost 13,000 feet, and that's very high. You're very exposed. You're above the entire boulder field at Lincoln Lake is above the tree line. Hiding under boulders isn't a great strategy, although a lot of people do it to keep themselves from getting wet. Those are things that you'll need to educate yourself. And there are plenty of resources out there, but those are important things to think about when you're heading into the mountains. And yeah, I can touch on the parking too at Lincoln Lake. So the parking always comes up as an issue. And the issue, in my opinion, is really that there are only 5 to 7 good parking spaces, or there are only space to park your car in the best spot for 5 to 7 cars. There's plenty of parking along the roadside if you're willing to walk 5 to 10 minutes. You can go down to the main kind of horseshoe of Lincoln Lake. There's a huge parking lot there, especially once the snow melts. There's room for 30 or 40 cars right there, and that would add a 5-minute walk down the road. I know climbers, ironically, can be kind of lazy when it comes to approaches, but you are going to Lincoln Lake. It is a pretty serious drop into that lake, and so if you're not willing to walk 5 minutes down, 10 minutes down the road, that's kind of what the rangers have recommended and said, there are plenty of spaces if you're just willing to not accept that you can't get the very best parking area.
And then I know that there's been something about keeping your tires off the road, right?
The road up to Mount Evans, the summit of Mount Blue Sky now, is very narrow, and there's it's kind of a beat up road. We want to make sure that when you are parking, that you're parking completely off the road and in the direction that you're driving. So, don't just pull in across the lane and park in there with your tire on the road. We want to make sure that everyone who's, we're not preventing other people who are trying to access the summit or wherever, that they have plenty of space. So it's for the protection of your own car anyways, because there is a lot of traffic on that road. And so just make sure that you have plenty of room to get off the side of the road. And if you're not sure, just, drive 100 yards. There'll probably be another parking spot for you with plenty of room.
Sweet. Cool. I'm glad we covered that stuff. Hopefully people didn't get super bored and stop watching. We want to just make sure people are doing it right. But it's not as fun as talking about 2001 Dave Graham. So
all right. Yeah. One other thing before we pivot, I do also have a relationship with the ranger at Mount Evans or Mount Blue Sky. And, it's the same thing. He wants to see climbers treat the area with respect, with kindness, with reverence. These areas are protected for reasons other than they just have cool boulder problems. And so we just want to make sure that we're kind of conveying that respect for the area.
Yeah. Sweet. Okay, so now, when did you first go to Mount Blue Sky?
So first trip to Blue Sky was 2003. I went at night to Lincoln. I take that back. That was my first trip to Lincoln Lake, was in 2003. My first trip to Mount Blue Sky was 2002. Ben Scott, kind of well-known developer in the Poudre Canyon and Red Feather Lakes, another guidebook author, prolific developer, was hiked down through Area A. He actually hiked from the top. So he went from Area E to Area D to Area C, Area B, Area A, saw all of it. Called me the next day, was like, we got to get out there. It's incredible. You love this stuff. Let's go. And my first day at Area A was I saw Ben do the FA of the Dolly. Bierstadt was still a project at the time. Syrah was a project. Basically, everything was a project. We did try, so I did the second ascent of the Dolly right after him. And then we did try No More Greener Grasses, which we were calling the Lime Wall project at the time. And one thing that's kind of interesting about the Lime Wall project is, so that next year, 2003, really famous kind of underground boulderer was in town, and I was climbing with him a bunch, James Litz. And Litz was known and is known for his incredible finger strength. And I've seen him do things on a hangboard that I've never seen anyone do. Just unbelievable feats of strength with his fingers. And we took Litz to the Lime Wall project, and Ben was like, "Yeah, let's put him on it. Let's see if he can do it." He could not do the shoulder move, or I'm sorry, he could not do the pinch beta, which is the normal beta that everyone does. And because the hold has changed, this doesn't come out very much, but the hold has changed considerably. It was much worse. And even James Litz, the person who I think no one has stronger fingers than James Litz, could not do the standard beta, which is done now. The way he did the bottom sequence was by going up left hand to the pinch, coming to this undercling, and then going right hand. And he did it that way. And he said, well, that's V15. And if you go there, I would encourage you to try grabbing that hold with your left hand and doing the move to the undercling. It's incredibly difficult and incredibly impressive. And it was cool to see this boulder problem that was so amazing go from seemingly impossible to now it gets probably done every day. I don't know, every week. It's done all the time. And it has changed a lot too. And it's, ultimately a lot of climbs change over their lifetime. And I think it's cool to see the changes.
Let's do it in just one session.
He never did the boulder problem. He may have
Okay.
come back and done it.
If you were to do it this way, it would be.
He did that lower sequence, and he was like, "Yeah, that's ridiculous. I don't know if I could do that again. I'm exhausted." He worked on it for a few hours before he did that, and then he was like, "Okay, cool, I did that." And I don't know that he ever came back and did it. And then Luke Parody ended up doing the first ascent with the kind of the old school shoulder method that almost no one does anymore because it's a lot harder than the new pinch method after the hold broke.
Yeah. And then, so that was in also 2001?
So 2002, I went to to Blue Sky for the first time. 2003, I took Litz there, and I think Luke did Greener Grasses in 2003 or 2004 for the first ascent.
Cool. And then 2003 was also your first visit to Lincoln.
Yeah, I went down in the dark, checked it out. So we actually, in 2003, Ben and I found the aerials on aerial photography, and Ben and I had gone up to the aerials, which are actually farther along the road than Lincoln Lake. We drove past Lincoln Lake. Ben told me it was garbage. Don't bother with it. We're not gonna care about that. We're just gonna go to the aerials, what became the aerials. So I found that photo. When we went up to the aerials, we hiked in there, saw those boulders. We're like, this is really cool, but the hike is gigantic. I'd kind of written off Lincoln Lake, and fast forward 7 years, no one had really done much of anything. I think Carlo went down to Lincoln Lake, kind of wrote it off too, said it wasn't very good. Carlo Traversi. And then I just happened to be living next door to Dave Graham at the time, and summer was rolling in. It was like this time of year, like May, and he was like, where are we going to go? We could go to the park. We could go, kicked around a few ideas. And he was like, I said to him, I said, there's a lot of boulders at Lincoln Lake and no one's really done anything. It's relatively easy to access. I think you should go check it out. And the next day he drove up there, and it was really awesome because he came back, and it was the first time I'd seen someone take like 30 videos with their iPhone. And he's like, check out this boulder, check out this boulder, check out this. He's just like going through boulder, 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 boulder. And that was our summer. Dave, Chad, myself, John Cardwell, Luke Parody, Daniel Woods, we all set it our mission to develop Lincoln Lake that summer. And we decided to promote it as well, which we had Dave and I had a conversation about like, are we going to try to blow this up or are we going to keep it quiet? And he's like, let's just blow it up, man. Be awesome. And we did, and it did. It did blow up. And I think one thing, I would never say that Lincoln Lake is Fontainebleau or South Africa, or I recognize that has its own limitations, but it is for its own unique place, a special thing. I think the setting. It's one of the highest bouldering areas in America, and kind of that unique talus pile of boulders. It's an incredible place, and we had a great time. We basically developed it for the next 3 years, and it was awesome.
Yeah. And at the time, was that Walvo land? Is that what that was being called?
Yeah, Chad decided that the marmots were mini Wolverines, and so he just decided to call Wolverine Land. And I think it was kind of a joke. I don't, some people kind of gave us crap about it, but yeah, it's become Lincoln Lake now and forever.
Yeah.
But for those that know, Wolverine Land will live in infamy. Yeah, so for specifically for Rocky Mountain National Park, Tommy Caldwell's dad went up to the park. He was the first one to go to Cass Canyon and recognize the potential for bouldering. Told Tommy, he was just fly fishing in the lake. Told Tommy, hey, you should go check this out. Tommy brought up Brian Capps, Dean Potter, Nick Sagar, some old school people, Theo Marin. I don't know if anyone didn't even know those names anymore, but they were dedicated climbers and boulderers at the time. They all went up there and started developing it. And then Brian Capps, a good friend of mine, knew Dave Graham from brought Dave in. Dave went crazy, right? Just blew it up. I've never seen anyone have that kind of an impact on an area so fast. And suddenly this area that was just kind of a cool spot to hike to with a couple little boulder problems had some of the hardest test pieces in America. And, at the time, bouldering wasn't that popular. I mean, I remember, kind of moving through time, fast forward to like 2006, it was hard to get people to even go to the park. No one seemed to care. No one seemed to want to go. And, um, from my own personal progression, I was always hiking, looking for boulders, putting chalk on things, seeing projects, trying projects, building landings. That process continued for a long time. And I think for a small number of dedicated people like myself, Chad, Dave, Daniel Woods, that was our scene. And it wasn't until 2009, 2010 that it really started to gain kind of international fame. And I think that was kind of punctuated when Daniel climbed the first ascent of the Green 45, which everyone now knows as Jade. That was one of the first V15s in America, if not the first V15 in America. That problem's also changed too, which is kind of interesting. It's a different problem than it was, but so yeah, this big crew of people, and then it was featured in the Dosage movie, and I think that really propelled it into kind of an international thing where people started to travel from. We started seeing Japanese climbers and European climbers come over, and yeah, just snowballed from there. From 2009, we go into Instagram, which is like 2012. I feel like Instagram does a lot to promote areas and quick news. I just put up this first ascent, it's V13. Here's where it is. Check it out. It just exploded from there. And during that time, 2009, I wrote the first bouldering guidebook to Rocky Mountain National Park in Mount Evans, and that was a direct response to a disaster of a guidebook that was written by a fellow. I don't need to name his name, but it was a really terrible guidebook, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of people in the community really encouraged me to kind of put out the good information, and that it was kind of time for a first edition of a park guide. And now, yeah, here we are, the time to entry. I could never have imagined. I think there's been an explosion of visitation in Rocky Mountain National Park from like 2.4 million in 2003, 2004 to like 4.8 or over 5 million in the last couple of years. It's unbelievable to see, especially after COVID, how many more people are going. We see the time to entry permits. We see the addition of climbing rangers that are not just hanging out at the Diamond, Longs Peak, but they're also hanging out as bouldering rangers in Cass Canyon. So it went from nothing. I mean, it was just 4 or 5 guys just going bouldering, hanging out at the boulders, to an international climbing destination. It's pretty wild to watch that over my lifetime.
Yeah. Pretty crazy stuff. Did you have certain problems or experiences up there that stand out to you, as whether it's first ascents or otherwise that you had like really memorable experiences in either of the areas?
Yeah, one thing that stands out was watching Daniel do the first ascent of Jade. That was a long standing project. I had tried it probably 10 days as a project myself. I knew it was really hard at the time. And I still contend that the problem was V15 for a while and then it broke. But it was a very hard problem. And it was, I remember running up there. I was spending 4 or 5 days a week up in the park, and I knew that Daniel had been close. He had done the move, and it was at night. There were a group of 10 people there, and it was just awesome to see such a hard problem. And it was awesome, it was also like I saw Daniel, I've met Daniel when he was 8 or 9, and he was just a little kid, and thinking like, oh, one day he'll probably be pretty good. And then watching him become kind of the next Chris Sharma, and seeing this kind of culmination of all that come together in the hardest problem in the park. And it was just a really, really memorable night and a really cool moment for him. And yeah. And then, just also, I spent so many days with people like Dave, cleaning, building landings, to coming up with new problems, and then watching these problems go from just a piece of rock with a couple ideas, a cold here, an undercling here, an E-bar, to wow, that was a new V13 that just got done. And wow, everyone wants to come try it. And oh my gosh, this is totally classic. Seeing that progression for me is one of the most the most motivating things that exists in climbing, watching these things just breathe, watching climbers breathe life into new boulders. And so I think, maybe there's not one moment with Dave that stands out, but just these days and days of putting up new climbs, watching them get named, and then watching them become not just a rock that he climbed one day, but a thing that people want to come do and kind of talk about as an abstraction for all of climbing.
Mm-hmm. What broke on Jade? I know at some point the heel broke at the start, but that was more recently.
Yeah, I think that was Nick Duddle actually broke the heel. But the right hand hold, the 2 finger, I think now you can crimp it with 3 fingers. And the reason I think that it broke is because it's now a 3 finger crimp, and at the time it was a 1 finger crimp. There was one split. It was a very awkward and painful hold. There was no 3 finger crimping on that hold at all. It was 1 finger, and you had to stack that 1 finger. And that's the state that Daniel did it in. I'm convinced that it was V15 at the time. But yeah, those things change, and that happens. Really cool to, I wasn't there, but just to see Adam Ondra flash the boulder years later, just awesome.
So you said you put like 10 days into it when it was still a project. Once Daniel had done it, did you still have motivation to do that climb? And was that, or did it kind of fade away and other things took
Oh,
priority?
I tried the crap out of it. I did the move, the crux move, and it was at the end of the season, and I just could never quite get back to doing it. So it's kind of one of my one of the boulders that maybe is going to go unclimbed by me. There's a few, but if you're trying really hard, those things happen where you get close and you just can't quite do it if you're really pushing it. And I think that was Jade for me,
One of the ones that got away.
the ones that got away.
Hey, maybe he'll still do it.
Yeah, you never know. So yeah, let me tell this story. So this is just kind of a very very old story that a lot of people really wouldn't know and don't just kind of some of the rich history of bouldering in Rocky Mountain National Park. So the way that people, Tommy's dad, Mike Caldwell, was the one who discovered Cass Canyon and had hiked there to fish, told Tommy about it. People had bouldered at Emerald Lake in the mid 90s, which is a long time ago. And there's a certain climber, Jim Belser, who was very instrumental in the development of most of the hard climbs at Emerald Lake. Jim was one of the first boulders in America to climb V10 back in the day in the mid to early 90s. So really, really great guy. And he was very helpful in documenting all of the problems at Emerald Lake. Like I walked around with him one day, just a great dude, super knowledgeable, mind like a steel trap. It was awesome. And but even before Jim showed up, I just kind of want to give a shout out to Jim because he's a really great guy. But even before Jim showed up, there was a climber, Jim Hurst. And Jim Hurst was bouldering with Dean Potter back in the day in Waco tanks. So this is before Dean even showed up in Yosemite. He was hanging out around Waco tanks in Estes Park. Jim Hurst was guiding people up Hallett Peak, which is where the gigantic rock face where the boulders came from for, Whispers of Wisdom and the Kind Traverse, those kind of classic problems. And Jim was guiding clients up the 5.7, the 5.8 there. And he had been to Waco and he recognized, wow, those are some really cool boulders we're walking past every day. And he said, hey man, I'll guide you up this wall if you give me a spot on this boulder problem. And the boulder problem is called In Your Face. It had a gigantic block that was ripped off the top of it. And that's why it's called In Your Face. And so Jim was trading basically spots for guiding people up these walls. Now, most people who are listening to this probably won't know In Your Face at all, but it's become known as the Kind, and it's probably one of the most popular V5s in the country. Super famous climb, and that's kind of the story about how the Kind came to be. And Jim then met Jim Belser in Waco Tanks, and then brought, Belser came up to Estes Park, and he was very strong. Started doing things like, the Kind Traverse and the large and real large, those problems.
At what point did it become the Kind, and where did that name come from?
To be honest, I don't know, because when I showed up in 2002, I think there would have been a little lull. Like Belser wasn't climbing as much in 2003, 2002, and maybe that name just didn't get passed around. I never heard it as someone showing up in 2002, and people just started calling it the Kind because it was the Kind boulder and the Kind Traverse. The Kind Traverse did exist, but yeah, it was later that it was called the Kind. So if you want to be accurate to history, that problem's called In Your Face.
And do you know why it was called the Kind Traverse? Like where the kind comes from?
Because they like to smoke weed.
It's kind of
A kind bud.
oh,
It's like a marijuana reference.
I'm not stoner enough, I guess.
Yeah. I think Ian Glass did the first ascent. So he was another guy who was climbing V11, back in 92. I know V11 doesn't seem like much now, but at the time, people weren't really climbing much harder than that. And so he was at the cutting edge and not only at the cutting edge of difficulty, but at the cutting edge of hiking the 2 miles to climb V11. That was totally unheard of. So I think it's kind of interesting to have that reference as to where we've come from.
Yeah. Who put up Whispers?
So, well, that's a great story, actually. So in doing research for the park guidebook, it was kind of well known that this climber, Adam Osterhoff, who was one of the early guys in the early 2000s who was there, he did the first ascent of Whispers of Wisdom. That was it was understood that Adam climbed the project at Emerald Lake, and that was the first ascent. And at the time, there was a gigantic tree growing right against the boulder. And so you couldn't actually top out without going through the tree. And so people just thought, oh, this is not possible as a rock climb. It's not a climb because you have to kind of climb through the tree a little bit. The tree fell over and Adam climbed the first ascent of Whispers of Wisdom. And I heard a rumor through the grapevine that another climber, Eric DeCaria, who is kind of, maybe well known in Utah circles around Moab, did some first ascents at the Big Bend boulders, that Eric DeCaria had actually done it. And I sent Eric a message and he was like, yeah, I did the first ascent. A lot of people were skeptical of that. And I have no reason to not believe Eric. He seems like a reputable guy. But other people were very skeptical that he had done the first ascent because he didn't make a big deal out of it. And so there's some maybe kind of, lost to the mist who actually did that first ascent of Whispers of Wisdom.
And does Adam Osterhoff maintain? Is he like, I did the first ascent? Or
I don't think Adam Osterhoff. Yeah, he doesn't climb anymore, and he's a pretty laid back guy. I think he would probably, I don't know. Yeah, he's kind of out of the scene. One of those whose climbing time has passed.
I guess it's like my question then is like, okay, well, who named it then? Was it Eric or was it Adam?
It was Adam. I asked Eric if he had a name for it, and he said he didn't. And some people thought that was a red flag, that you would climb this incredible boulder problem and not name it. But then again, Eric is kind of a reclusive guy. And, you never want to really, doubt someone unless there's some evidence to doubt them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And which FAs of yours would people be most knowledgeable of in the park?
Yeah, some of the ones that I think back fondly of are Riddles in the Dark. That was a huge roof that I actually had walked past a mutual friend of ours, Lee Payne. Lee and I were walking, and I said, Lee, there's this amazing boulder problem here. And he wrote me off, laughed. This is ridiculous. There's nothing here. And yeah, I did the first ascent of Riddles in the Dark. You know, Paul Robinson came by a few weeks later and did Riddles in the Park, which is maybe a little more well known than Riddles in the Dark. And that happened because the snow melted 5 more feet. I wasn't aware that there was 5 more feet of snow to melt. You know, if you boulder in the park, you know that there are huge snow drifts that pile up and can make landings that seem ridiculous totally plausible. And so I didn't know that the landing would melt more. I climbed it from the lowest start that I could climb it from. And then Paul came along a few weeks later and did the lower start. But it's a great boulder problem, amazing roof. Also Lonely Mountain is a V9 that I put up. Just we called it the I think it was like the Death Roof 2000 or something. We found it one year at the very end of the year, one of the last days, sat on it all season, and then came up the next year and climbed it. And I actually, kind of a funny story about that one is I had a bunch of projects in upper chaos. Almost no one was going to upper chaos. And I had all these projects cleaned off, ready to go, including The Shining, the Wheel of Chaos, Lonely Mountain. The list goes on and on. All the classic projects were projects that I cleaned and was psyched to try. And I ran into Jimmy Webb, mutual friend of ours, and Jimmy's like, man, I know you got projects. I know you're hiking up farther and you got projects. And I was like, yeah, I do. And I said, you know, I'm happy to show you stuff. There's one project that I'm close on. I've been thinking about it for the last 6 months. I'll take you there. Please don't climb on that, but I'll show you some other things. And he's like, no worries, man. I'll just, you know, you can do it and just show me something else. And I was like, all right, cool. So we go up there and Jimmy sees it and he's like, oh my gosh, this thing is amazing. He's like, let me climb on it. And I was like, dude, you're gonna just do it. It's like V10, no problem. And he's like, I won't. I'll just do the moves and I'll drop off. And sure enough, he just did the moves, dropped off, and said, have it, man, go do it. And I did it. And then we walked over and I showed him The Shining. He did the first ascent of The Shining, which we always called the Ice Cave Project. He did that in a day, which is pretty awesome. That's a great boulder problem. And then we moved over to the Wheel of Chaos and just went nuts on those climbs as well.
Which one was the one that was your big project that he did the moves on? Which climb was that?
Lonely Mountain.
Oh, that was Lonely Mountain.
Yeah, Lonely Mountain. Yeah.
Nice. What a stand-up guy.
What a stand-up guy. He won my
heart nice about not snaking our projects in the wind.
He he won my heart that day, Eric. Yeah, it was great move by Jimmy. And I was like, dude, you're such a good guy. And I was like, here's all the projects. Have them go nuts. And he did. He went crazy. He put up a bunch of really cool problems in upper chaos.
Yeah, I'm hoping to. I still haven't been to upper ever. I went up to lower like 2 days. I got 2 days in before surgery. So
okay. And lower, what does lower seem like to you? Does it seem trash?
The climbing quality?
Yeah.
No, I mean, well, so I was climbing on the Cat Ranch boulder, which I think is
pretty good.
I had a really good time. And I've been to lower a few times in the past over the years, and a lot of the stuff's like not that interesting to me. Like European Human Being and like Autobahn stuff, I'm like, I could kind of do without. But I want to do like Nothing But Sunshine, and I want to do Freshly Squeezed. Like there's quite a few problems that I'm stoked on. I mean, I think the GoBot's amazing.
Yeah, it is good. It's contrived, but it's very good. It's fun to climb on. You know, one thing I can kind of add here for the podcast, you know, one of the unique things about climbing in the park that's unique from a lot of other areas is that it gets a ton of snow. And every year we see 15, 20, 30-foot drifts, which are hard to believe until you've seen it and you've seen your favorite boulder problem completely buried in the snow, and then it melts out. And the unique thing about that is it's a cool phenomenon, but it provides these ways to climb boulder problems that have horrible talus landings. Like, you know, one of the problems you mentioned earlier was Cat Ranch, and Cat Ranch is like not climbable for, you know, no one climbed on it for 15 or 20 years because no one thought to go up in April when the snow is drifted underneath there, and forms a perfect landing for this incredible roof. So that problem went unclimbed for many years. And then suddenly someone went up early, maybe Dave, you know, and decides like, oh, this would be cool. You know, there's a 2-month window where you can climb Cat Ranch. and it's one of the best V13 in the country. It's an awesome boulder problem. And so that snow landing aspect of it is something that's very unique to the park. There's not many areas in America that have that. Maybe see it in Tahoe, but not too many other areas have that.
Yeah. And that kind of makes me think about Autobot. Was that because that's like one of the easier classic problems in Chaos? I feel like Chaos is known for so many hard boulders. Was Autobot already kind of established, or was that in the same wave of establishment from Dave and those guys?
When you say Autobot, you're talking about the line, the V5 to the right of GoBot.
That's Autobot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Autobot was one of the first things that they put up, and that was done without a snow landing. I think, guys climbing V12, V5, on a sketchy landing is not going to be super crazy. That one actually was unnamed for a long time, and I gave it the name Autobot for the first guidebook because I felt like it was a classic problem and it should have a name that's appropriate.
How'd you
And
come up with that name?
just right to the right of the GoBot.
But does it mean something, Autobot?
Transformers, I think it's like a Transformers reference.
But yeah, like Autobots roll out.
Yeah, exactly.
Autobot, is that also a Transformers reference?
I don't know. It might be, or it might be a Dave Graham rap music reference, which is like where a lot of his names come from, like
Yeah.
Sunshine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That one I think looks really sweet. I would like to climb that.
yeah, and at the time, speaking of that climb, like people, that was a pretty jumbled landing. And like by today's standards, that's normal. People are used to those kind of jumbled landings. Crash pad technology has changed a lot. Crash pads are pretty flimsy, they were pretty small back in the day. So people weren't super excited about jumping on something that they could break their ankle on, that the pad may kind of fail them, that they actually need spotters because the pads aren't great. Now people throw down 7 organics and it's like you could backslap from 20 feet and be totally fine. That was kind of a new paradigm that people were, the pads weren't great and people were still pushing hard moves over bad landings. Even Tommy Zarette, if you're a V7 climber and you get on Tommy Zarette, that ending is pretty scary. And that was kind of a new thing for bouldering. Bouldering wasn't done over bad landings like that for a long time until crash pad technology really got a lot better.
So was it like crash pad technology got better and guys like Dave and Chad and that whole squad started implementing that in the Alpine, or were they already climbing the Alpine with just like not good foam?
You know,
Not
so they
proper.
were using cordless pads. That was kind of the gold standard for a crash pad. Everyone had a cordless pad. And the cordless pads are pretty flimsy. They were taking up, they would go up with a crew of 5 or 6 guys and then they would spot. You don't see a lot of active spotting these days, but people would actively, that was a part of the thing, is that you're really going to spot someone well, kind of guide them onto the foam that is there. And yeah, and you had bold climbers. Tommy Caldwell is a pretty bold climber. Dean Potter was an extremely bold climber. And so I think there was this whole thing going on where there are bad landings. They do have kind of not great pads, but they're willing to be a little bold and push things in a way. You look at things like Skyscraper or High Tower, those huge high balls. Those are pretty significant high balls back in the day, especially given the bad padding that people had.
Yeah, totally. Something earlier that I was thinking about when you were like naming off all the folks who were there, like Dean and Jason Kale and Dave, it's just like kind of interesting the way to see like all these prolific climbers kind of do a bunch of travel and then they find like their spot, like Jason's in Waco and Jimmy's in Tahoe and Dave's in Switzerland now and like Dean was in Yosemite. It's kind of interesting. People like take ownership, almost like these hardcore developers take like they find a spot that they really like and they like settle there and they're like, I'm gonna really make an impact here.
Yeah, I agree with that. They find a place that really speaks to them and maybe really works for their lifestyle and their life. Jason's got a couple of kids now, and Dave is. Yeah, I've always feel like Dave's heart was always in Switzerland. It just so fits his personality and his climbing style. And yeah, our paths all converged at this one moment, and then we've all kind of gone off and done our own things. And we still, I think, maintain contact in some regard on varying levels with each other. But it was just a moment in time, and maybe there are other areas in the country that are having that moment where people will look back in 20 years and say, "Oh, remember when Eric, I was in the New River Gorge with this person, and those guys came on a trip, and that V15 got done. And, right before that was the trip that Jimmy and Daniel put up those hard problems. And like, you may look back on those things one day and kind of reminisce and think about where, where your life has been. And yeah, it's pretty wild. It's, one thing is someone who's been going up there for almost 25 years, it's wild to see the same boulders, the same boulder that I walked up to when I was 24 is right there. There's Tommy's Ret, just as it always was. A little more chalk, a little more boot rubber, but it's the same thing. And it causes me to reflect on my own life. The boulder hasn't really changed, but I've changed a lot, and that's kind of it allows that reflection to happen, I think, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Yeah, on that note, you can sort of wrap up. Anything else you want for whoever may be listening or few fans out there?
Yeah, I think, we all have an impact. I always like to say that you're not in traffic, you are traffic. And we all have an impact. Our actions do matter. People are watching, and we don't have to shoot for the lowest possible common denominator, worst behavior ever, so that we can do our climbs. We can be respectful. We can be nice. We can save, because people were respectful before, you now have the opportunity to climb in these areas. And I think that, if you continue that respect, other people may have the opportunity to climb in areas as well. So the Rocky Mountain National Park is a beautiful area. It's an incredible zone that was protected well before climbing existed. And I think we should all take a part in kind of championing that legacy.
Yeah, well said. Okay. Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.